It is not uncommon to hear people say, well, the reason I do not read the Bible is that I do not understand it. I read a passage and I just don't know what's going on. And if you happen to be one of these people, I suspect that this passage of Scripture proves your point. You have to ask yourself, what in the world is going on in this thing? And maybe you read it and you don't even have a clue. Maybe you look at it and going like, I think Jesus is talking about the end times. I think he's talking about the second coming. And you'd be right about that. He's also talking, though, about the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem in a little earlier in this, and it gets a bit muddled up. But even if you know that context, you're still left with all this imagery. What do you do with this? You're left with this passage near the end where Jesus says to this group of people, this generation, that generation, won't pass away before all these things happen. What do you do with that? How does that make any sense? And if you look it up and find enough commentators, you'll finally get someone to tell you, well, Jesus in that moment is probably talking about the destruction of the temple, not the second coming. It's just a mess. It doesn't help that most of us, all of us, don't care. Now, I mean that politely. What I mean by that is I will be amazed if someone after the Mass tells me that you got up this morning, turned to a loved one in the family and said, I wonder if the good Lord will return today. We don't think that way. We just don't bring that up. It's not on our radar to use that expression. And so, because it doesn't seem to be important, we listen to this and we say, oh, we're talking about the second coming, so I don't actually think it's important, and I have a hard time understanding it, and so I think the best response for most of us is just, okay, could we just move on to something else? But I think there are some better options. I will tell you that my ancestors had an interesting way of handling this. They kept it in their head by singing. They would just sing about the second coming. I have no idea where I learned this. It is somewhere deep in my childhood, but as I was thinking about this, it just flooded back into my head. I don't remember the verses, I just remember the chorus. It goes, Jesus is coming soon, morning or night or noon. Many will meet their doom. Trumpets will surely sound. All of the dead will rise. The righteous meet in the sky, going where no one dies, heavenward bound. They just sang. They just sang about it. That's how they sort of kept it in their head. It's a strategy. It worked for them. Another possibility is, of course, you could just learn about it. You could dig into the details. You know, well, what is it? There's a reference in that gospel about the tribulation. What is that? There's all sorts of little bits and pieces over in Scripture. And of course, in our day and age, this isn't hard to do. A little simple internet search, you'll pull up a ton of stuff about end times, the second coming. I just need to warn you, if you're typical, the first thing you read or the first video you watch, it's going to sound pretty good. It's going to say like, oh, that makes some sense. I get that. But if you watch a second video or read a second article, you're going to get something that also makes a lot of sense, but is a little different than the first one. And the third one you watch or read is going to be a little different than the first two. And that is because what's in the Bible is a lot of allusion, a lot of hints, if you will, little bits and pieces. And what people do is they take all those data points and make a story out of it. And some people, they make different stories out of it, and some people put things in slightly different orders. So I don't know that one is any better than the other necessarily, but just do be aware that you can't find a definitive source that's going to probably lay this out for you. Certainly you're not going to find a source that everybody agrees with. But maybe that would be helpful. knowing more about it. Maybe that would keep it in our mind. In my case this week, I was wondering if perhaps what might be more helpful to all of us is to do the opposite of that. Instead of looking at all the details, back up and look at the big things that we absolutely know. So if you take 2-3 steps back, what does Jesus say about all this? Well, first, Jesus says that he is coming again. We believe that. You're going to say that in the creed in a few minutes. And he will come in glory to judge the living and the dead. That is our belief in the second coming. We bring that to our minds, hopefully, every week. So we know that. The second thing, you heard it here today. It also is in other places where Jesus says to the disciples, you do not know when this is going to happen. And some of you are old enough to remember lots of people who told you when the end of the world was going to happen. And I hope you laughed at them. Not impolitely, but I hope you inwardly chuckled because, of course, they didn't know. And the reason I know that they did not know is just from this passage of Scripture. Jesus says, don't try. You cannot figure it out. Only God knows. No one else does. It's not a game. It's not a puzzle to be solved. Jesus says, you don't know the day and the hour. And then you get to the third thing Jesus says, because you do not know the day or the hour, you really need to make sure that you are ready. Are you ready? But see, that question, you go back to what we talked about at the beginning. You say, well, am I ready? What difference does it make? You're like, this is probably not going to happen this afternoon. In other words, I need to plan the youth group meeting tonight because I don't think it's a good idea to bank that the Lord's going to show up at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And so there's this thing, well, since I don't know what's going to happen, and it's probably not going to happen even in my lifetime, so why get ready? Well, I was wondering if we could go back to the you don't know the day or the hour and remind ourselves that we also don't know the day and the hour of our death. Think about it, our death and the second coming have an awful lot in common. It is the end for us, either way. And in both cases, we believe Jesus is going to judge the living and the dead, that we are going to, in that moment, get a conversation with God. Now, I know some people, they think judgment, they get very fearful, they think, some judge on a bench with a big gavel. I actually tend to look at it a little differently. I actually think of it as a conversation. I just picture getting to heaven and getting face-to-face with God, and God wanting to talk about a few things. And that's might be an interesting way for you to consider, are you ready? Or is there a possibility that you're sitting here thinking, as I often do, kind of hope God doesn't bring this up? Because it's going to get awkward. Like God looks at you and says, and so tell me about this disagreement you had with your sister 30 years ago that you never worked out. Like, tell me about this? Because at that point, you just realize, like, it's never, like you're just in trouble at that point. I just wonder if that might be a terrific exercise for us today. Ask ourselves, am I ready? Am I ready for my own death, which, sadly could happen sooner rather than later. We'd never like to think of our own death, but it's very possible. And indeed, the good Lord could come back at 3 o'clock this afternoon. I don't know. But you have to ask yourself, am I ready? Would I be ready for that conversation? And if, as you're thinking about it, surely you'll think, well, if the good Lord brings up, my care of the poor, for example, you think, well, that's going to be a great conversation because, I always bring food when they ask me to. I do all this stuff. That'll be great. But if you would be brave enough to ask yourself, are there any topics that I don't want to talk to the Lord about? Maybe then it would be some incentive to say, okay, I need to do something about this now. Because so many of these kind of things, we think we have plenty of time. And we think, oh, I'll get to it. You know, the broken relationship between you and somebody in the family. All right, eventually we'll work it out. But many of you know stories where people ended up at funerals, and the thing they regret is that they never worked it out. It's now too late. They never had the chance to say, I'm sorry, I love you, you know, whatever needed to be said. It was just too late at that point. And that's, I think, what we need to remind ourselves, that there are some of these things, if you will, awkward conversations with God that we could do something about. At least we could begin to start. So that if we died, you know, sooner rather than later, and the conversation comes up, we can honestly say to the Lord, like, I know you're right, I was working on it, you know, kind of ran out of time, but at least I was trying. So that's sort of the bottom line. Are you ready? Am I ready? Because the good Lord could indeed come at any moment. And indeed, we could tragically die at any point. And so we just need to keep reminding ourselves, one way or another, am I ready? Am I ready to meet the Lord, to enjoy the Lord for eternity? But mostly, am I ready for that moment, that conversation with the Lord?